Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And by golly, we are so fortunate today. We have finally gotten Olaf Hage to come back on our show. And Olaf, as you know, is an excellent researcher. He's a writer. You will never find a better researcher than Olaf. And go to his website, theTimeQuest.com. Very interesting website. And I think the last time we talked to Olaf was right around the time that New Orleans was having problems. And we did an audio file with him at that time. But today, we're going to talk about energy. And this man knows a lot about that topic, let me tell you. Hi, Olaf.
Hi, Georgianne.
How are you doing?
I didn't realize it had been that long.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
I thought it was only a few months. How time flies.
You're not kidding.
Well,
okay, what, you know, everybody is going to just fall over when gas is $5, $6, $7 a gallon. Then they talk about these hydrogen cars, nuclear energy. You know, Olaf, it's really confusing, and I don't know.
Well, today the price of oil in the crude market, and of course by the time people hear this, it's going to be different. But today it fell down to $63.68.
Yeah.
It's been trying to get back up to the Katrina levels for years now.
Yeah.
We've seen them trying to get up to the $78 a barrel level, and they haven't been able to make it. And I've been saying that the price of oil is going to fall to $41 a barrel. And I started saying that back when it was in the 60s some time ago, and it fell down to $49 briefly one day. Then it chugged back up to $69 on a spike earlier this year. And it's been trying to get back up there. It's gone down to the upper 50s and then back up to 66 and change, and then back down to 61 or something, and back up to 66 and change. And now it's back down around 63, 68. So, and of course in the overnight markets it keeps trading, and you never know what it's going to be at any given second. There are some pressures on the oil market that people never even think about, and there are some consequences of all of this that they're not paying attention to.
Okay.
Look at those, especially because they could come back and bite us, if you will, in the infernal extremities there. If we aren't careful, we're going to make things much worse. And indeed, some of the policies that people are talking about will do exactly that. Now, I don't know when we're going to get this posted, but hopefully, if this is still Wednesday, May 2nd, for people, they will be able to go to Headline News tonight, where Glenn Beck has a program. And he's on just before Lost. So he's on in the hour before Lost, so you won't miss Lost if you watch him. And he'll also be on an hour after Lost. He's also going to be on during the Republican debate, but I don't want to discourage you from watching that. But he will be on 3 times tonight with a program on global warming, where he's debunking the whole Al Gore mythology and really calling it, I think, a religion. Although maybe that's Rush Limbaugh who calls it a religion. I guess Glenn Beck doesn't dare do that.
Well, it is. It's pagan.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's dealt with in a religious way by a lot of the proponents of it. It's not that the temperature of the planet isn't getting warmer. That is happening. There's no question about that. And it will get colder again, too, because the temperature globally fluctuates as solar activity fluctuates. You can go back for thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, and you can see dramatic fluctuations in temperature. We're actually in a pretty good time. It's been a lot hotter and a lot colder than it is right now. Let me give you an example. A few thousand years ago, the Arctic was ice-free. There wasn't a drop of ice in the Arctic Sea near the North Pole. So when they start saying, oh, we think the Arctic ice is breaking up, and we may someday soon be able to travel from Europe to China across the top of Canada and so forth, the so-called Northwest Passage,
Yeah.
realized that Columbus was looking for that. I mean, not necessarily Columbus personally, but Verrazano and some of these guys, Hudson, some of the great explorers who've given their names to areas in the Northeast up here, these guys were actually looking for the Northwest Passage, which the Vikings and others had apparently been sailing through. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, apparently, that there was a big enough melt-off that you could get through the Arctic Ocean. You still can't do it today, even with icebreakers.
Yeah.
So we're much colder than they were in the medieval high, as it's called, 1,000 years ago. And if you go back even further in time to the pre-Christian world, they didn't even have ice at all in the Arctic Ocean at that time.
That's right.
So, you have to go back to about 4,000 BC for that, but still, that's relatively recent in terms of global climate.
Well, what about that? Is it called the Rhesus Map that shows the Arctic with no ice, or the Antarctic?
Yeah, there is a map that was found in the I think it was Elizabethan times or somewhere around there. I'm not sure exactly when they did.
Yeah.
And they found it in an old, I think, Arabic text somewhere or whatever. I can't remember the exact provenance of this map. But according to Charles Hapgood and others who researched it, they felt that this showed the Antarctic ice-free at some point, or relatively ice-free, at some point in the historic past when somebody had made this map. It shows what appears to be at least a large portion of Antarctica's beneath the ice coastline that we've mapped with sonar and things. So somebody in the ancient world was able, apparently, to sail to Antarctica and map part of the coastline of Antarctica, as well as the southern tip of South America and so forth. So it must have been a very different climate than what we now see, and that was at some point in the historic past. By historic, I mean, here's a written document that's got words on it, so I'm calling it history. But, that's the usual standard in history, by the way, is if it's written. So at some point, thousands of years ago, somebody was able to go to South America, and it didn't have as much ice as it now has.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting puzzle. And then you've got the buildup of ice in the center of Antarctica and in the center of Greenland, where some studies are showing it's actually getting deeper. And that the reason that you're seeing the break-off or calving of big ice sheets from Antarctica is because they're being pushed off the land by the buildup of ice in the middle of Antarctica. So it's actually pushing the ice out into the sea, and then, of course, it becomes floating sea ice.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, see, that ice is already supported by the water to a large extent. And as a consequence, that ice is laying on the ocean, and it is not going to affect sea level significantly. Only the ice that comes off the land will affect sea level. Ice that's already floating in the sea, such as in the Arctic Ocean or that's off the coast of Antarctica, that does not affect sea level. So I know Al Gore is in a tizzy over this, and I'm sure it might affect his tobacco crop if global warming occurs. And I guess he's worried that it would harm to grow tobacco on his farm there in Tennessee. But it is possible that global temperatures may fluctuate in one direction or another at any given time in history. But what we're seeing is a 10,000 to 12,000 year warm cycle that we're just ending that peaked about 4,000 BC. That's why the Arctic Circle was ice-free then. And now what we're going to see is that the Arctic ice is now beginning to shrink a little bit, but this is part of a cycling process, that you don't just go from warm to cold and from cold to warm in one step. what happens is there's a gradual bouncing downward that you do, where you go up a little bit and then down and up, not quite so far, and then down and up a little bit and then down and so forth. Now, the preceding warm peak during the medieval high, about 1,000 years ago, was warmer than the one we're in now. And the preceding warm peak before that was warmer still, and so forth. You see the pattern here. And with each step downward, we're going to get colder. Now, the last cold step, about 200-300 years ago, was called the Maunder Minimum in terms of the sunspot activity, and it resulted in what they call the Little Ice Age, where, you could skate on the rivers in Europe, and it got so cold, for example, that you had famine and plague breaking out in certain parts of Europe. This is the time, for example, of the great bubonic plague epidemic that struck in the 1600s. People forget that these events have occurred periodically in cycles down through the last 2,000-3,000 years. We have detailed records. And we can see quite clearly that the climate doesn't stay static, that it goes up and down in cycles. And we've been in a warm cycle coming out of the Little Ice Age for a while. But we're not as warm as we were 1,000 years ago. And now, certain standards that they measure, certain things, they say, well, there's more CO2. Yeah, that may be. But you know what? We're not as warm as we were. And that's one of the problems, is that people aren't taking note of the fact that the global climate hasn't warmed as much as the CO2 increase should indicate it should have. And that's why a number of scientists now are questioning the whole linkage between CO2 and global warming. And they're wondering if that really is the cause of it. For example, volcanic activity releases CO2. We've had a lot of volcanic activity. You know that some of these large volcanic eruptions release more CO2 than all the automobiles in the world release? I mean, I think people have got to understand here that the natural cycle is far more powerful as a driving force in climate than most of the things that human beings do. The natural cycle is extraordinarily powerful. Let me give you another example here. And many of you probably have already heard this. But I started to notice back about 20, 25 years ago, and I've been studying energy and climate issues since the late 1960s, which is almost 40 years now. It'll be 40 years in 2009 that I will have been studying these things. And back in the 1970s, we started to notice right near the end of the 70s that there was a brightening occurring on some of the outer planets, that Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus were showing an increased albedo or reflectivity of light. There seemed to be something going on that was causing them to appear intrinsically or reflectively brighter to our telescopes. And nobody was quite sure what it was. Now we have been able to, because we've been sending spacecraft by them, we've been able to actually measure temperature changes on a lot of these planets. We just passed Jupiter, by the way, with the New Horizons spacecraft, which is headed out toward Pluto, and it's taking some more measurements of Jupiter. We're finding that these planets, not just the Earth, are warming. It's not just higher light values being detected by our telescopes, but we're now detecting higher temperatures on these planets.
Yeah, they said that, what is it, Olaf? Mars is warming, and there's no SUVs up on Mars.
And there are no SUVs on Jupiter or Saturn or Neptune. And we're, like I say, we're going out to take a look at Pluto as well with this New Horizons spacecraft. It's on its way out there at the moment. So what we're looking at is I don't want to use the word global here, is a space or solar system-wide phenomenon. Now, there have been two proposed, or maybe three proposed theories to explain this. One is a change in solar activity. That's what I think is most likely to be the cause. The second possible driver for this phenomenon is some sort of hyperdimensional wave that's coming through our region of space. It can be driven by the collapse of of a major star somewhere sending out some sort of interdimensional gravity wave or something of that sort. Anything that might contain energy and that therefore might energize everything it passed through, which is why I sound so hyper at the moment, or why Glenn Beck gets his own TV show. Anything that energizes globally, if you will, not just the Earth, but the stars, the planets, and everything around them. Now, that could trigger a change in solar activity. I mean, you energize the planets, you're going to energize the sun. It would stand to reason. That theory has been put forward by Richard C. Hoagland and a number of people who are interested in the whole field of hyperdimensional physics. I'm not ruling that out as a factor, but we do know from historical data that solar activity has fluctuated on a regular basis, so that, and we can trace this, by the way, to the effects of the planetary orbits around the sun. That is to say, the cycle of the planets as they orbit the sun reinforce their gravitational tug and pull on the sun so as to disturb solar activity. And that, in turn, leads to a change in the solar cycle, which results in a feedback system where it then heats up the planets with a change in the kind of radiation that the sun puts out. It's not so much the amount of radiation coming out of the sun as that these subtle disturbances in the sun cause it to change its ultraviolet output or its infrared output, and parts of the solar spectrum that we normally don't pay a whole lot of attention to when we monitor solar activity. At the height of the solar cycle, about 11 point some odd years on average, because it can be as short as 7 or as long as 14 years. At the height of the solar cycle, the sun can put out maybe 2% more, maybe 3% more light than it puts out at the bottom of the cycle from the most extreme measurements we've had to the other extreme. However, if you think about the planets tugging and pulling on the sun, if they all line up on one side of the sun, they will pull the sun one full solar diameter. That's about 756,000 miles or so, or 800,000 miles out of position. I think actually it's a little bigger than that. It's something like 846,000 miles, I think, wide. But several 100,000 miles that the sun has moved out of position, one full solar diameter, then move the planets around the other side of the sun, it tugs it back the other way. Now that, of course, is relative to the inertial frame of reference that you're using. But the sun is, in effect, shimmering like a big bowl of Jell-O as the planets move around it. Jupiter, of course, has a huge effect. Saturn has a significant effect. The outer planets, as you go out further, less and less. Surprisingly, a little planet like Mercury, because it's so close to the sun, can have a measurable impact. And the Earth and Venus, because they're fairly massive and fairly close to the sun, have a significant impact. Mars is not so hot. I mean, it doesn't affect it as much. And the asteroids are fairly minor. And they're scattered all the way around, so they kind of cancel each other out. But in general, what we can say is that Jupiter, Saturn, the Earth, and Venus, and a little bit also for Mercury, those 5 planets seem to trigger a lot of the solar cycling that we see. So we could figure on a solar cycle change based upon just calculating the orbits of the planets. And in fact, this was done. Back in the 1950s, there was an RCA engineer who sat down, and he was concerned about solar activity affecting broadcast television and broadcast radio signals. And you still hear that occasionally. They'll talk about solar flares today might affect your radio or other electronic broadcasts and so forth and your telephones. Well, the same thing was true, of course, back in the 1950s. So this engineer sat down and he said, well, I wonder if I can predict these. And so he started to look into the solar cycle and the planetary cycles, and he discovered that by calculating the orbits of the planets, he was able to predict very accurately when there were going to be disruptions of radio and television broadcasts brought about by changes in solar activity triggered by the orbits of the planets. So we have known for, just about exactly 50 years now, maybe a little over, that this was going on. We're able to predict this in advance. And that's why, for example, they will say to you, well, we know the next solar peak is going to be around 2012. They can see it coming. And this is one of the reasons they're able to do that. So we know that the planet's orbits are driving this. So I don't think hyperdimensional physics certainly is the sole explanation for that when we have such an obvious and simple mechanism to explain the changes in solar climate effects. Those things are pretty predictable now. There is a third possibility, and that is that you might have some other kind of non-interdimensional phenomena. Again, like a gravity wave or energy being poured out by beam of a jet from a quasar or something like that streams into our solar system and can add energy to the whole system. There are technologies for detecting some of these things, and at the moment there does seem to be something coming from M87 that's headed in our direction, and we may be receiving something from that. M87 is located in the sign of Virgo and is the heart of what we call the Virgo supercluster of galaxies, of which we are an outlying member. So we are a part of that system, and this thing at the core of it is a huge galaxy called M87. It doesn't even have a name, it just has a number, But it does have a tremendous jet, and it is pointed more or less in our direction. So that is one possible outlying explanation. But in general, what we can say is this. Your car is probably the least likely thing to be affecting global climate. Given that these other things that are available here to drive global climate, it really seems unlikely that what's coming out of the tailpipe of your car is going to be that big a deal. Automobile exhaust is only a tiny part of all of the global carbon dioxide emissions. It's a very small part of the total. And so what you drive really has relatively little, if any, effect on global climate. And in fact, it may even have surprisingly different effects than people expect. For example, what about methanol? You know that your car now is increasingly being fueled with methanol. We're putting more and more of this fuel into our automobiles, and we're putting, or ethanol, and we're putting various similar biodiesel-type substitutes into some cars and a lot of trucks and so forth that burn diesel. And where is this stuff coming from? Well, it's coming from corn and soybeans. Now, the corn harvest in the United States in 2005, 14%, that's 1 out of every 7 bushels of corn that we produced in the country, 1 out of every 7 was used to produce ethanol. Now, that's a huge amount of our corn output.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Now, that was only 1.7% of the gasoline usage. So here was 1/7 of the corn producing less than 2% of the gasoline, additive to the gasoline. And then you take a look, for example, at biodiesel coming from soybeans. About 1.5% of the soy harvest produced enough biodiesel that was equivalent to 0.1% of the gasoline usage. So these are tiny amounts. Now, just think about this for a minute. If you took every single acre of corn that we grow, forget food, forget meat, by the way, because your meat is basically corn fed. That's chicken, that's turkey, that's beef, that's pork, you name it. And in fact, it's probably a lot of your milk and eggs as well. You took all that corn and all those soybeans out, and you stopped producing any of that for food and used it all for fueling our cars and our trucks. Okay?
Yeah.
How much do you think we would eliminate? The answer, only 1 out of 8 gallons of gasoline would be substituted. It would only reduce gasoline consumption by 12%. And our diesel use would only be reduced by 6%. That's a drop in the bucket. And that just converted every single acre we've got to the production of just fuel, of all that corn and all those soybeans. Now, to say that producing this is stupid would be an understatement. I mean, it's obvious that this is a mistake. But wait a minute, there's more. Since we're already doing this, do you know what it's doing? It's driving up the price of gasoline, because this stuff's expensive to produce. And you know why it's expensive to produce? According to a study done by Cornell University in New York and UC Berkeley in California, they have found that every kind of domestic biofuel source, methanol, ethanol, biodiesel, whatever, those currently in use, as well as those that are only under development, that we're not even using yet, produce less energy than is consumed in growing and processing the crops. In other words, we're worse off. Every bit of this that we use is making us worse off than we were before. So we're actually producing, in effect, more pollution, more greenhouse gases, and so what's the net effect of this? Your car doesn't get as good mileage. You are actually having problems with the cars. They're not working as well as they were before. Some of the valves wear out. There's damage to internal parts of the automobiles. But even more than that is the fact that it drives up the price of gasoline, because you're actually using more fuel altogether than we were using before. The stuff is more expensive to produce, because how can you possibly burn all of this gasoline and diesel fuel to produce the crop and come out with a negative number and have that being a cheaper fuel additive? You can't. It's got to be more expensive. So we grow this stuff with our corn crop and our soybean crop. We ship it off to our oil refineries, and then we put it into the oil refineries, the mix of gasoline, which they ship to your gasoline dealer and so forth. And then all of this stuff ends up costing you more at the pump.
Yeah.
We can actually say that about 60 cents of every gallon, just take the price you just paid for gasoline, take away 60 cents, 60, okay? That's how much cheaper your gasoline would be if this wasn't being done. And we're trying to increase it. They just passed another bill, I believe, to increase the amount of ethanol that they're going to be using in cars.
Oh, my God.
This is stupid.
Yeah, it ruins a lot of things in the engine and rubber, you know.
But those people out there, those congressmen and senators out there in Nebraska and Iowa and these other states that grow these crops, why, they're all excited. And the farmers are all excited because there's demand for their crop, which is driving up the price of corn and soybeans, and therefore of meat, of chicken, of turkey, of pork, of milk, of eggs. Have you been to the supermarket? Have you looked at what's happening to the price of milk, the price of all of these other things?
Well, you know, Olaf, they cannot just outright say, no, you can't drive your cars anymore. So what they're doing, the thing that you need to drive your car, fuel, they're fixing the fuel now so it'll ruin your engine.
Oh, I don't know that it'll ruin the engine, but it's certainly not doing it any good when you put fuel in there that the car wasn't designed to burn.
Well, yeah.
Now they're designing special cars to burn higher mixes of these things.
Yeah.
Some of them are out on the road. You can buy them in certain cases, but think about this. Why in the world would we even bother doing that when it's impossible for us to switch over completely to such fuels? And even the small amount that we're putting in here makes no rational sense. Do you know that only 3% of our oil imports come from Iraq? 3%. And do you know that we don't get hardly any, if any, gasoline out of that 3%? I mean, what is it that people are worried about here? Is it that we won't have gasoline or something? Well, where do you think your gasoline comes from? Gasoline comes from the paraffin content of the crude oil. Crude oil from the Middle East doesn't have a good gasoline content. It's very low paraffin. It isn't able to be burned in our high-compression vehicles here in the United States. Now, in Europe, they have a lot more diesel vehicles. They have a lot smaller engines. They've redesigned their cars to burn a different fuel mix, and they get a lot of their fuel from Libya and other places, Algeria and so forth in North Africa, where it does have a high paraffin content. But, we were boycotting Libya altogether until recently. We get our high paraffin content, high gasoline content crude oils from Alaska, which, of course, that Alaskan oil we gave to or sold to the British. Nobody seemed to bother worrying about that. And from Texas, and from the Gulf of Mexico, and from off the coast of California, and so on. There is some from Venezuela. There is some from Nigeria, and so forth. But the Middle East, as such, that is not where we're getting our gasoline from. So you can do all you want to your gasoline engines. You're not going to be able to solve the problem of what's going on over the Middle East. And I hear politicians all the time saying, well, if we could just, find a replacement for the internal combustion engine, we wouldn't be worrying about the Middle East.
Yeah, right.
Not true. Absolutely not true. People just don't get it. Now, 100 years ago, we had oil refineries, a little over 100 years ago, back when Rockefeller was still a little oil company in Ohio, Cuyahoga River, and John D. Rockefeller Sr. was refining oil and starting to monopolize the oil industry. He was dumping the gasoline into the Cuyahoga River, and it was catching fire.
Yeah.
What to do with it? Because he couldn't use it for anything. You need a special kind of device, we call it an internal combustion engine, to make use of gasoline. It's so volatile, so explosive.
Oh, yeah.
You wouldn't put it on a ship, a tanker or military ship or something like that as a main fuel source. Even coal was a very dangerous fuel to use on ships. There are some people who believe that Titanic sank because of a coal gas explosion. They want to make sure they got a nice, safe fuel. That's why they use diesel.
Yeah.
And you look at trains for a minute. The coal-burning steam locomotives were replaced by diesel-electric hybrids. Every diesel locomotive that you see out there today, all of those diesel locomotive engines, they're actually electric cars on rails powered by a diesel hybrid engine.
Huh.
So General Motors, by the way, is the primary producer of those engines, Alco and the electromotive division of General Motors. We've been producing diesel-electric hybrids, General Motors has, for over 70 years. Now,
wow.
Why can't they do
Oh, my gosh.
a truck or a car?
Yeah, why?
Because they don't want
to.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because the diesel engine is a much simpler engine. Why is it that trucks, go on forever? Diesel-powered vehicles last a lot longer than the internal combustion engine.
But you take a truck, a diesel truck, in for service, it'll cost you 4 times more than if you take a gasoline, a regular kind of truck in for service. Both are expensive, but they nail you for and diesel trucks cost a fortune.
Well, the way they've got this set up, it's a supply and demand thing. It's how many diesel vehicles you produce versus how many gasoline vehicles. They produce in this country every year, I think it's something like 10 million gasoline vehicles, and they produce a few thousand diesel-powered vehicles. Yeah. The more diesel vehicles you produce, the lower the cost per unit on each of the parts and so forth is. And also you'll have more mechanics who specialized in it. You'll have, it's easier to find a mechanic to repair it and so forth. When you've got so few diesel vehicles in the country, that's the reason that it's a problem. It's not because the technology itself is inherently more expensive. It's just because there are so few diesel vehicles relative to the number of gasoline vehicles out there that they can command a premium for those things. Now, look, they've got this market sewed up. You've got a handful of competitors in the diesel market. I think the diesel truck market, I think is, 3 or 4 different companies and in the electromotive division and the Alco division. I think there's maybe one other company that produces diesel locomotives for the railroads. There's very little competition in these fields.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more competition in the gasoline automobile business. In this country, there's only a handful of companies, but we have other companies worldwide that compete in this field. So your car is, it's being used as a political bargaining chip between corn state politicians and people who are in the oil states and other people and so forth. And they're fighting over all of this. But it really doesn't make any sense. You go back, as I was saying, a little over 100 years ago, they were throwing gasoline away. Our crude oils here in the Western Hemisphere, and as I say, a few of those in Africa, they produce this gasoline as a byproduct. And if you don't have any use for it, what will happen? They have to throw it away. Now just think of the environmental impact of that. The best thing we could do to gasoline is to burn it in a car with an engine that will efficiently burn all of it so that it doesn't pollute the atmosphere. Well, exactly what we've got right now. Our cars are extraordinarily efficient. They're something like 98.9% of all of the pollution that the car was producing back in the 1960s has now been eliminated by various things that we've done to make the cars burn cleaner. But the reason they liked the internal combustion engine over 100 years ago was because it wastes 94% of the fuel you put inside it.
Oh, my goodness.
94%. Well, look at all those valves going up and down and sideways. It's a little menagerie of mechanical activity.
Yeah.
It is mesmerizing to watch it. But all of that activity, and it's really fascinating to engineers and to guys who like to, fiddle with their cars and stuff. But the bottom line is that's all wasted energy. I mean, you look at diesel or you look at a lot of other types of engine, and you'll see that they are far more efficient. In fact, you can look at the Prius as an example. It's got a gasoline engine in it, right? And so the gasoline engine is wasting all of that energy. It's then used to power a generator to produce electricity, and the electric motor then powers the car. Okay? Well, it turns out that the electric motor, which is about 90% or better in efficiency, versus 4, 5, 6% for the gasoline engine typically. Yeah, just think about this. I mean, you're at opposite ends here, right? The electric motor is so efficient that even with all of this system like this, the Prius still gets 2 or 3 times the mileage of a straight gasoline engine. Now, how can that be? Well, what happens is that the gasoline engine powers the electric generator to charge the battery. The battery then runs the car in stop-and-go traffic in the city. And that's where your gasoline engine is at its least efficient. When you're out on the highway, the gasoline engine takes over and runs at its most efficient speed. So that you get the best efficiency you can out of your electric motor. But then they have what they call the synergy drive, which is basically a flywheel system to store up the energy of the braking system of the car. So every time you step on the brakes in a Prius, you're stealing back some of that energy that you've already expended to get the car going. You're putting it back into the battery or the flywheel so that car can then use that to power the electric motor again. So that's how it's able to run up these high efficiency standards. And the bulk of the gain of the Prius is in the city driving. So if you only drove it, for example, out on the highway, you're not going to see as big an improvement. It may be just about even, But if you run it in the town, why, you do stop-and-go driving and the kind of suburban driving that most people do most of the time, yeah, you'll see a big advantage. Now there's a silly thing going around on the internet that's claiming that the Hummer is actually a better car than the Prius in terms of mileage and energy consumption and so forth. And it's a joke.
It is a joke.
And people think this is for real. Look carefully at that email that's being forwarded to you by one of your friends or this story that you've seen. It says that the EPA changed its testing procedure for the Prius. So instead of doing 55 miles an hour on the highway, which is what it does standard for all cars, it changed it for the Prius in order to show how efficient it really was, you see. And it ran it at 80 miles an hour in the highway test.
Oh, my gosh.
Nobody averages 80 miles an hour on the highway, unless you've got a Ferrari or something and there are no cops within 50 miles. It's absurd. And obviously, this is a fake story, but people are not getting it. They don't get the joke.
Yeah.
But even after that, the Prius got 46 miles per gallon.
Oh, wow.
Still more than anybody's getting with a gasoline engine, except in one of these really tiny little mini cars, it's clear that the hybrid is definitely an improvement. You can get a diesel, a pure diesel, to run as much as 100 miles per gallon. Now, that's a small, efficient diesel engine. If you put a diesel-electric hybrid on the road, you could be looking at 150, maybe 200 miles per gallon. Okay, I mean, we could, if we really had to, if we ever really run out of gasoline-rich crude oils, we could shift to that. What we really need to do is to come up with a more efficient way of burning gasoline. And believe me, there are a lot of people working on that, and that is going to occur at some point. Because as long as we need oil for anything, and we do need it for a lot of things, we're going to have to figure out what to do with all that gasoline, because there's a lot of it.
Yeah.
And we got to burn it or dump it in the rivers or something. I mean, what are you going to do with all of that? So this is a problem that nobody's really paying attention to. Let's talk about nuclear for a moment, because I know that Glenn Beck, his special tonight, is going to, and we're talking May 2nd here. I know that he's going to probably mention nuclear power. If he doesn't, I'd be surprised. But he's pro-nuclear. Trouble with nuclear power is it's just like biofuels. It's just like methanol and ethanol, these other things. More energy goes into it than we get out of it. Now, that doesn't happen right away. A lot of it does. But the system for uranium is that once you get the uranium, and that's not easy to do to start with, you have to enrich it to concentrate the part that's radioactive so that it will create heat so that you can boil water, so that you can run a steam generator, so that you can generate electricity. You follow all of that? The beginning of this process is enriching the uranium. How do you enrich uranium? You burn coal. Burn coal in an electric power plant, and you run a uranium enrichment plant. What we're so worried about the Iranians building over there in Iran, the uranium enrichment plant is what is going to concentrate that radioactive uranium, the U-235, so that you can make it have a reaction that will produce enough waste heat so that you can generate enough to boil water and then run a steam generator and so forth. So the whole thing is to get the uranium hot. If you don't enrich it, you can't get the uranium hot enough to boil water. And so in order to enrich the uranium, you've got to concentrate the radioactive part down to a very small space, in other words.
Yeah.
You have all this leftover uranium, which we call depleted uranium, which you then put in bombs and use in artillery shells to penetrate armor. Okay? We dropped tons and tons and tons of depleted uranium on Bosnia back in 1999.
Yeah, thanks to Clinton.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if the reason that we go around engaging in these wars is so that we have some place to get rid of all of the depleted uranium, which is, after all, still mildly radioactive.
Oh, yeah.
So we're dumping it on Bosnia. We're dumping it in Iraq. You see the problem here?
Sure.
And as General Electric and Westinghouse, the two main nuclear power plant builders out there, as they continue to build nuclear power plants outside the United States, they haven't built any in the U.S. in decades because it's cost inefficient here. The utilities discovered that it costs too much to operate the things.
Well, by golly, Olaf, they're dangerous.
Oh, dangerous.
You know, I mean, a huge earthquake or God only knows what could happen. A meltdown. They are, look at Chernobyl.
Yeah, okay. But Chernobyl was inland, in the middle of the Asian landmass, okay, far away from most major population centers in the world. There were some major cities in Russia nearby, but basically it was fairly isolated there. No water runoff from Chernobyl that was going to end up in the oceans very easily. There was something released to the atmosphere. They dumped a lot of concrete on top of the thing, and they stopped that. And they've got some local problems with radiation there and cancer deaths and so on. However, there's enough radioactivity in your local nuclear power plant to be the equivalent, if it were totally released into the environment, of a third world war, of a thermonuclear war. World War III is in your local nuclear power plant in terms of the amount of radioactivity. Okay. Chernobyl was well contained because it was inland and not easily released into the rest of the world's environment. But your local power plant is typically on a river that flows right out into the ocean. In some cases, it's practically on the ocean. We've got some up here in New Hampshire that are literally on the beach.
Well, the Russians want to build floating nuclear power stations.
Yes.
Out in the ocean. I mean, you know, they float.
That is a crime against humanity as bad as anything Hitler ever did.
No fooling.
If you put a floating nuclear power plant out there and something happens to it, that radiation goes immediately into the world's oceans.
That's right.
And it's evaporated up by the sun and rained down on everybody on the planet.
Right.
We're talking mega deaths here on a scale that nobody has ever conceived of. We're talking huge amounts of people could be affected adversely, as putting it mildly. We're talking people dying of plutonium radiation poisoning. We're talking of massive amounts of cancer. I mean, this is just it's a horrible scenario. And now we're just talking about accidents. We're talking about earthquakes. We've got nuclear power plants built on earthquake fault lines. There's a fault line that goes right up to the front door, and God knows whether it goes through it, of the Indian Point nuclear power plants, number 1, 2, and 3, just off the Hudson River, north of New York City.
Well, and look at the one, is it Palo Verde? Or no, what is the one in California that they built right over a fault line?
Right, Diablo Canyon and some of these others. I mean, it's a canyon. Hello, could it be a fault line? Gee, I wonder. It's California. Gee, possibly. Hey, look, this is really absurd.
It's insanity.
We're building nuclear power plants worldwide. And we're saying to the Iranians, oh, we'll help you develop your nuclear power system as long as you don't build bombs. What, are we crazy? Look, we have enough problems with nuclear power just falling apart all by itself.
Yeah.
You almost lost Detroit back in the 1960s due to a nuclear reactor problem. We had one in Hanford, Washington that went bad. We had a nuclear problem down, of course, at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, just not too far away from Washington and Baltimore in terms of how the wind blows. We've had nuclear accidents that have almost wiped out major American metropolitan areas. We have others that are in danger here. That one out in California, everybody says, well, I don't live near California. It's not a problem for me, dude. Well, I got this for you, dude. That one out in California, there's an earthquake out there, and God knows they do have earthquakes, don't they?
Yeah.
Earthquake out there, and that plant dumps its radiation into the Pacific Ocean. The sun will evaporate up all that radioactive water and dump it on you, dude.
Well said, Olaf, well said.
And all that weather blows from California across the country to the east, so there's nobody in this country is safe if that plant goes. Don't be thinking, oh, I'm not in California, it's not a problem for me. It's a problem for all of us. But we're talking about accidents. We're talking about earthquakes. Are we forgetting there are terrorists running around targeting that very nuclear plant and other plants around the world? We have had reports from people monitoring the terrorist activity of the world saying that they have, in fact, been looking at these nuclear power plants as targets.
Yeah.
You also know that they are developing the ability to put together dirty bombs, all kinds of other nuclear material. Where are they getting it from? Where is all this nuclear material floating around the world coming from? It's coming from nuclear power plants. thing we need to do is to get a government here in the United States, because we're the father of all of this technology. We're the ones who started it. Okay, it started here in this country because our scientists felt guilty because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the atomic bombs we used. They wanted to find peaceful uses of atomic energy, and everybody was wringing their hands and feeling sweaty and guilty and sad. And you know what? They've created a worse monster than the thing they were worried about.
Yeah, you're right.
This is far more dangerous because every nuclear plant is a whole thermonuclear war in a box, just waiting for some suicidal nut to go out there and decide that he's going to create a one-man jihad and penetrate that site and cause a meltdown or blow open the containment vessel or whatever it takes to create a terrorist catastrophe there. This is a very dangerous scenario, and we've got this problem all over the world now, and we're spreading nuclear power. Tell me, since this nuclear stuff is going over the world, we're enriching the uranium here. Our coal is being used to put the energy into these fuel rods. Then we ship the fuel rods, which is our coal energy, over to these other countries that then use these things in India and Pakistan, all over the world, to produce nuclear weapons, some of which they then conveniently allow to fall into the hands of terrorists. My goodness sakes, this is absolutely insane. We're literally carrying the energy deficit of all of these other nuclear plants that our uranium is being used to fuel in other parts of the world. And then we get jealous because Iran is going to have its own uranium enrichment plant. And, of course, it'll be fueled by burning oil, Iranian oil. They're going to burn their own oil. Well, we don't want them to do that. You know, that's a waste of oil, and also it's going to break the monopoly that Russia and China and Britain and France and the United States have on uranium enrichment. Mm-hmm. You know? I mean, this is all about the money. Nobody cares about the fact that they're wasting coal, wasting energy, creating all of the supposed greenhouse gases. Let me go back for a moment to the biofuels thing. If we produced all of the automobile fuel from growing corn and soybeans and so forth, do you realize how much reduction there would be in the amount of greenhouse gases supposedly produced by the vehicle itself? Forget the system that supplies the fuel, because we know it's a net negative, so it's not going to. It's actually going to produce more greenhouse gases. But the vehicle itself will still produce better than 90%, or somewhere around there, 88 to 93%, as much greenhouse gases as it did before.
Yeah.
So you're not really making any significant change here. So what is all of this stuff about carbon dioxide? All of the pollution controls that we've had put on our vehicles over the last 37 years or so, since 1970, they have been aimed at burning the gasoline more efficiently, reducing carbon monoxide and unburned hydrocarbons and nitrous oxides, and the end result was to increase the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the tailpipe of the car.
Yeah.
We have worked for 37 years with all our environmental rules, and that's not just for cars, but for power plants, for industry, for everything. We've been trying to maximize the amount of carbon dioxide that comes out of our cars. And they are estimating that this year, China will produce more carbon dioxide than the United States does. They're exempt, by the way, from the Kyoto Treaty.
Yeah, and that Kyoto Treaty, boy, that's a deadly thing.
Yeah, even if we had signed this treaty that most Democrats voted against, by the way, when it came up in the Clinton administration, even if that had gone through, the Chinese and the Indians and other nations who were exempt from it would still be producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide, as if that actually has an impact here. Remember that one volcanic eruption of any significant size produces more carbon dioxide than China, the United States, or really all of these countries together.
Olaf, we've got at least 10 or 12 active volcanoes erupting every day.
Oh.
on this planet.
That's not all. Yeah,
Jeez.
I mean, they're always producing carbon dioxide. Do you realize that every blade of grass, every bit of biological matter on the planet exhales carbon dioxide all night long? Do you realize that every time somebody breathes or talks, every time any animal, every living thing on this planet gives off carbon dioxide, I believe. I mean, there may be some virus or something that does it, but virtually every living thing on the planet produces carbon dioxide. Now, if carbon dioxide were bad for the environment, why would the environment be going to so much trouble to produce so much of it?
Yeah, really.
Okay, let's say the climate does warm temporarily as we head down into the next ice age here. Let's say it does warm even more than it's already warming up. By the way, we're going to love global warming when we get into the next ice age. It's going to be a lot worse than the 1600s cold snap was. Mm. We're going to be begging for global warming. They're going to be looking for gasoline-burning engines to put back on the highways. You know?
That's right.
But let's say, for example, that we were able to get to the point where we had increased temperatures and everybody was moving north and so forth. Take a good look at a globe sometime. The amount of land expands as you head northward. Just look at a globe. Look at a map of the world. The further north you go, the more land there is. Okay, but look where the agriculture is taking place. Look where most of the crops are grown. If we move northward with our agriculture, we're actually going to have more global land mass available in way to be able to produce, the amount of food that we're going to need in the future here.
Yeah.
Actually, it could be good for us.
Right.
So people don't realize that we could be better off if we had global warming, not worse off. In fact, the worst thing that could happen to us is if the weather turns cold again, like it did in the 1600s. You want to be dealing with the plague and famine? Because that's what will happen if it turns cold and the growing areas move south where there's less land, and most of the land there has already been overfarmed. And a lot of it's desert if you take a look at it. What are you going to grow there?
Yeah, really.
Well, it would, this isn't necessarily going to be bad for us. Yes, a lot of the rich people in Florida will have to move inland off of their little coastal estates, Mr. Limbaugh. And yes, there will be some people who will have to move inland from their little coastal estate on Long Island. And yes, there will be some cities like New Orleans, which is already underwater, already below sea level, move their people inland. But half the people who evacuated from New Orleans, I believe the latest I heard, they still haven't come back, have they?
Yeah.
Good. And this idiot administration and the Congress that are trying to rebuild New Orleans, this is stupid. We already know it's underwater. What is the point here of moving these people back to that position? We should move them to high ground, where they are now, by the way. Just let them live where they are now. Many of them are quite happy where they are. Why are they trying to attract them back? Oh, Mayor Nagin isn't getting enough federal aid?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. We should be decommissioning the nuclear plants that we have. We should stop exporting nuclear power around the world. We're the leaders. We should show a good example. We should put a stop to this. We want to start shifting to a more efficient vehicle. We can certainly switch to electric cars. We now have a device that will charge an electric car in 3 minutes. You can still use the gasoline and gas turbines to produce the electricity in the power plant. There's a way around that, but it's far more efficient than the current engine is. They come up with a better internal combustion engine, all power to them.
But, here's one of the problems, too, Olaf. The very people that need those kind of cars and trucks, the working people, the guys that go out and pour concrete and put up buildings and dig ditches that need trucks, they put these new these technologies out of the price range of these people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's true. I mean, there's a lot more we can say on this, and I know the hour's over now, but it's been really it's been a very complex process over the last almost 40 years that I've spent learning about this subject.
Oh, yeah.
Consulted in this area to consumer groups and others. And I have to tell you that a lot of the issues never change. the boondoggles, the pseudo solutions like hydrogen or nuclear or whatever come along, and people never bother to see what the net energy result of all of this is. It's sad. I just hope that Glenn Beck gets smart and doesn't go down that path. I know a lot of people are trying to promote nuclear again. It's a really bad idea. Well, if people want to check out my website, they can go to thetimequest.com. That's THETIMEQUEST.com. All one word, by the way, thetimequest.com. And there's my email on there. You'll see a bunch of articles, get about 50 articles up there. Stuff on the Da Vinci Code, things like that as well. All kinds of subjects you'll find on my website.
Wow. Well, you have some tapes, too, that are for sale.
Yes, and find that up there, too.
Yeah. And your information it's astounding, and I really would suggest, folks, that if you are interested, Olaf's research it's astounding. And go to his website, thetimequest.com, and get in touch with Olaf Hage. You will be amazed at the things that he has to offer. A very gifted man. I mean, God Almighty has a very special place there for Olaf. Believe me, he's a very gifted man.
Let's hope it's not too hot.
Yeah, Olaf. Oh, you always come up with these funny things. My goodness. Well, I would like so much if we could maybe get, once a week or twice a month, have you back and do updates on these current events, things that are in the news, because...
Well, I'll try to be more frequent than once every 2 years.
Yeah, that would help, Olaf. It really would. Okay. Well, God bless everybody out there listening, and go to thetimequest.com. If you don't know Olaf Hage, get in touch with him. If you've got questions about today's show, and I'm sure some of you will, get in touch with Olaf Hage, and they can do that through your website, right, Olaf?
Yes, they can do it through the website. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, and God bless you for coming on the show today, Olaf. This is such important.
Thank you, and God bless you and everyone listening.
Thanks. This is such important information, and it gives a much more truthful outlook on what is really going on there. So pay attention, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes with Olaf Hage, news behind current world news. And wait a minute, Olaf also is very involved in biblical and ancient history studies. So pay attention to that also when you go to his website. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Good night.